In this video, I'll cover the process of collecting annotations. I'll talk about preparing data for annotation, organizing annotations, selecting annotators, and finally touch upon some different annotation environments. This video is the fourth in a series of videos about data collection. If you haven't watched the first three, you may want to watch those before continuing this video. This video focuses on collecting annotations, which is of course a very central component of data collection overall. It's what you've been preparing for as you model your problem, determine your dataset specifications, and develop your annotation schema. As you get ready to collect annotations for your data, there are a few final questions that you should answer in advance, all of which help you adequately prepare your data for annotation. For example, you'll need to decide whether your annotators should know the source of the text they're annotating, whether they should know its author, or whether they should have access to other metadata like part-of-speech tags, dependency relations, or if you're building your dataset on top of an existing corpus, prior annotations. All of this information could potentially bias your annotators, which you should avoid. However, in some cases it might be directly relevant to the annotation task to include some of this information. For example, knowledge of the speaker or author can be highly useful for identifying subtle forms of sarcasm. All of the things you see here are examples of things that might bias your annotators. Knowing that a review received 3 stars could suggest neutral sentiment if one was annotating whether a review was positive, negative, or neutral. Knowing that an article was flagged by a social media site as being biased could suggest that an annotator could label it as misinformation, perhaps for a dataset of fake and real news excerpts. Datasets created without careful attention paid to potential biasing factors could have deceptively high inter-annotator agreement, only to lead to models that underperform in the absence of those factors when deployed to real-world tasks. Another way you might prepare your data is to perform pre-processing steps prior to obtaining annotations. Preprocessed data can potentially support annotators by providing useful information that either supports or directly advances the annotation task. For example, providing annotators with part-of-speech tags and dependency trees when they are assigning semantic role labels could help them to quickly identify different types of roles. However, providing irrelevant information could be counterproductive and lead to confusion. In the same example task, providing annotators with sentiment labels could be distracting and lead annotators to make incorrect inferences about the relation between sentiment and semantic role. Beyond providing supporting information, for some tasks it may make sense to automatically assign labels for your task directly and then ask annotators to correct them. This works best if you have access to a system that is fairly close to your end goals. You, of course, are unlikely to have one that conforms exactly to your end goals, because if you did, you wouldn't need to build a data set. But you may, for example, have access to a Twitter emotion detector that you could apply to your data set of Reddit posts that you are labeling for the same emotions. Annotators are generally able to fix mistakes more quickly than they're able to generate labels from scratch, so this can expedite your data collection process. Once you've prepared your data, you should also decide ahead of time how your annotations will be organized. Common solutions for organizing annotations include using markup labels, for example in XML, and using CSV files with rows corresponding to instances and columns corresponding to labels. You should ensure that you have a consistent and well-documented system for linking the annotations that you collect to your source data and any necessary metadata. The last thing you want is to collect a bunch of annotations only to discover that you lost the alignments between the labels and the data instances themselves. After you've prepared and organized your data, you can finally select your annotators. There are a variety of different sources from which you might choose to recruit your annotators. Factors that may influence who you choose to use as annotators include whether the annotation task requires specialized knowledge, such as For example, proficiency in a specific and uncommon language or medical expertise, and what resources you have available. If you have a large research grant for your project, you may be able to hire expert annotators more easily. If you're short on time, you may want to explore the quickest annotation options. And if you're planning to create a really large data set, you may want to focus on options that are both quick and cost-effective. Some common examples of tasks requiring specialized knowledge include those necessitating close reading or familiarity with colloquialisms. For example, a data set of idioms in a specific language would be best labeled by native speakers of that language, as well as tasks using domain-specific data, such as medical notes, or tasks concerned with specific regional dialects of a language. Resource availability can hinge on many different factors. Financial resources are important. If your financial resources are limited, it may be difficult for you to convince expert annotators to sign on to a project. However, time is equally important. Most annotators are only able to focus on an annotation task for a few hours at the most. After that, they can too easily become distracted. If you want an entire large data set to be labeled by the same small group of experts, this could mean that collecting that data will require a significant time investment. Likewise, if your annotation task is particularly complex, annotators may be extra slow at the beginning. Chances are they'll speed up as they get used to the task, but this could mean that it would be impractical to use, for example, crowdsourced workers, since it's difficult to retain the same annotators for extended periods of time. Based on your needs and resources, you will need to decide whether in-person or crowdsourced annotators are best suited for your annotation task. In-person annotators are generally available for longer periods of time, and it's easier to directly interact with them to provide initial training as well as feedback on their annotations. However, it may take longer overall for them to complete annotations, and they may also be more subject to bias, since it is much more likely that they'll be familiar with the project's end goals, other annotators, or behind-the-scenes methodologies. Crowdsourced annotators are generally faster, in part because you can have a ton of crowdsourced annotators working on labeling different data instances at the same time. They're also less likely to be subject to bias for the reasons discussed previously, since they generally work independently and do not have close knowledge of the project itself. However, they're also generally less invested in the annotation task itself for the same reason, so may be less careful in their annotations. It's difficult to provide much task-specific training to them, and there's minimal room for annotation feedback. They may also complete only a few out of many possible annotations, making it much likelier that your data instances will be labeled by many different and often non-overlapping people. Your in-person annotators could be people who you know already, as friends or lab mates, or they could be people who you hire specifically for the project, such as undergraduates studying specific topics. Linguistic and psychology are often useful subject areas for annotators to have expertise in, or individuals with task-specific expertise, such as medical doctors. You can easily find crowdsourced annotators on Amazon Mechanical Turk, as well as other crowdsourcing platforms like Appen. Finally, but certainly not least importantly, you'll need to choose an annotation environment in which you'll actually collect your annotations. This is mostly important if you're using in-person annotators, since crowdsourcing platforms often have built-in annotation environments. For collecting in-person annotations, you could simply have annotators write notes and text documents, but many different dedicated annotation tools exist that resolve some of the issues that may come up when using less sophisticated annotation environments. Some of them are listed here, and many of them contain built-in functionality for pre-processing your data or even computing inter-annotator agreements. When selecting your annotation environment, you should make sure that it works on all of the computers that you and your annotators might use. For example, choosing an annotation environment that is only supported on Windows when you and your annotators all use Linux-based systems could cause a lot of unnecessary headaches. You should also make sure it supports the types of annotations you need. If you need to annotate relations between spans of text, for example, you should make sure that there is functionality for doing so, and includes any extra features you need like built-in search functionalities or part-of-speech taggers. You should make sure that your annotation guidelines are easily accessible as annotators complete their work, and that the environment is easy to install and use, especially if your annotators are unfamiliar with the environment. Once you've set everything up, prepared and organized your data, and selected your annotators, you're ready to start collecting annotations.